When I first met Carla, I thought I'd stumbled into one of those rare moments where life hands you something perfect on a silver platter. We were just kids back then, barely 21, still figuring out what we wanted out of life. She had this warm, easygoing energy that could light up a room without even trying. Her laugh was contagious, and her hazel eyes seemed to hold a world of possibilities. I met her at a small community event in our hometown. She was volunteering at the snack stand, wearing an oversized t-shirt and jeans, with her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She didn't look like she was trying to impress anyone, and that's what drew me to her. She was real. We started talking, and before I knew it, hours had passed. We had so much in common, a love of movies, a shared sense of humor, and a mutual belief that the best things in life were the simple ones. I asked her out that night, and she said yes. Fast forward a couple of years, and we were walking down the aisle. I remember looking at her in her wedding dress, thinking I was the luckiest man alive. We promised each other the world that day, vowing to build a life filled with love, trust, and commitment. And for a long time, we did just that. We moved into a modest house in the suburbs, the kind of place with a big backyard where kids could play. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours. We worked hard to make ends meet, me in construction management and Carla as an administrative assistant at a local company. It wasn't always easy, but we made it work. 2 years into our marriage, we welcomed our daughter, Emma. She was our little miracle, a bright and curious child who brought so much joy into our lives. Not long after, our son, Lucas, came along. With 2 kids, life got busier, but we embraced it. Every soccer game, school play, and family road trip was a reminder of the life we'd built together. Now, 16 years later, things are different. Carla and I are in our late 30s, and while we've managed to keep our heads above water, life has settled into a routine. We still share the same house and the same car, but the spark that once made our relationship feel extraordinary has dimmed. We don't fight much, at least, not about the big things. Most of our disagreements are about the small stuff, like who forgot to take out the trash or whose turn it is to pick up the kids. It's not bad, it's just predictable. I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss the way things used to be. There was a time when we couldn't keep our hands off each other, when every conversation felt exciting and every touch felt electric. Now, it feels like we're just going through the motions. But that's what marriage is, isn't it? It's not all fireworks and grand gestures. It's about partnership, about sticking together through the highs and lows. At least, that's what I've always believed. I thought Carla felt the same way. I thought we were in this together, even if it wasn't always perfect. Looking back now, I wonder if I missed the signs, if there were little cracks in our foundation that I chose to ignore. Because when things started to change, it felt like it came out of nowhere. I didn't know it at the time, but those small changes would soon snowball into something I never could have anticipated. Something that would shake the very core of our family and force me to question everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd spent my life with. The first sign that something was different came in the form of her wardrobe. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just small shifts I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't known Carla so well. For most of our marriage, Carla had been a creature of habit. Her style was simple and practical, leaning toward jeans, sweaters, and comfortable flats. She didn't fuss much with makeup, aside from the occasional touch of lipstick or mascara for special occasions. She always said she preferred feeling like herself over chasing trends. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, her wardrobe started to change. It began with a new dress, a sleek, form-fitting number in a bold shade of red. I remember when she walked into the living room wearing it one Friday evening. "What do you think?" she asked, twirling slightly so the hem of the dress swayed around her knees. I blinked, caught off guard. "It's different," I said, trying to hide my surprise. She laughed, brushing off my reaction. "Different is good, right? I thought I'd try something new." At the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured she was just experimenting a little, maybe inspired by something she'd seen online or in a magazine. But then came the heels, higher than anything I'd ever seen her wear. Then tighter jeans, lower necklines, and a growing collection of jewelry that sparkled far more than her usual understated pieces. It wasn't just her clothes. Carla started paying more attention to her appearance in general. She got her hair colored, something she'd never done before, and started spending longer in the bathroom each morning, applying makeup with a precision that felt unfamiliar. I couldn't help but notice. How could I not? She looked incredible, no doubt about it, but the sudden change was unsettling. This wasn't the Carla I knew. "Do you have a big event coming up at work or something?" I asked one day as she stood in front of the mirror, lining her eyes with a dark pencil. She shook her head, smiling slightly. "Nope. Just trying to feel a little more like myself." That answer stuck with me. More like yourself? She'd always seemed comfortable in her skin before. So why now? At first, I told myself it was just a phase. Maybe she was feeling restless, trying to shake up the monotony of daily life. We'd both been feeling the weight of routine lately, so I figured this was her way of spicing things up. But then her behavior started to change too. She became more outgoing, more confident, almost to the point of being flirtatious. I noticed it in the way she talked to people, the way she laughed a little too loudly at jokes, even the way she carried herself. She started getting more text messages, her phone lighting up constantly with notifications. "Who's that?" I asked casually one evening as her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. "Oh, just a friend from work," she said quickly, grabbing the phone and tucking it into her pocket. It was the same answer every time I asked, and while I didn't want to be the paranoid husband, I couldn't ignore the way she seemed to guard her phone like it held state secrets. Her nights out became more frequent too. She used to stay home most evenings, unwinding on the couch with a book or a show. But now she had plans, happy hours, dinner with colleagues, the occasional girls' night. "Don't wait up," she'd say with a breezy smile as she grabbed her purse and slipped out the door. I'd sit on the couch after she left, staring at the empty space where she used to be, wondering what had changed. One night, after she came home late smelling faintly of wine and perfume, I decided to ask her directly. "You've been going out a lot lately," I said, keeping my tone light but curious. "Is everything okay?" She looked at me with that same easy smile. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "You just seem different lately." "Different how?" she asked, tilting her head. "I don't know," I admitted. "You're dressing differently, going out more, spending more time on your phone. It's just not like you." Her smile faltered for a moment before she laughed it off. "You're imagining things, Steve. I'm just trying to have a little fun, that's all." Her words sounded convincing, but her tone didn't. There was a defensiveness there, a flicker of something that didn't quite match the Carla I knew. I let it go for the moment, not wanting to start a fight. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The changes didn't stop, they only became more pronounced. What started as a shift in her wardrobe and behavior began to seep into other parts of our life. Carla was always busy now, even when she was home. If she wasn't texting on her phone, she was locked in the bedroom, FaceTiming with people she vaguely referred to as work friends. When she spoke to me, it was as if she were reciting lines from a script, her tone pleasant but detached. She wasn't rude or mean, just distant, like her attention was always somewhere else. The first time I really felt the sting of her absence wasn't on one of her nights out, it was during a weekend at home. Saturday mornings used to be sacred in our house. We'd sleep in, have pancakes with the kids, and spend a lazy day together as a family. But that day, Carla was different. She came downstairs in a fitted blouse and a skirt that seemed more suited for a date than a quiet morning at home. Her makeup was meticulously done, and her hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders. "Do you have plans today?" I asked, eyeing her outfit. She hesitated for a split second before flashing a bright smile. Just running errands. Thought I'd dress up for a change. Errands? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. She shrugged. Sometimes it's nice to feel put together, you know. I nodded, but the explanation didn't sit right with me. Carla had never been the type to dress up for a trip to the grocery store. She left shortly after breakfast, and I spent the rest of the morning trying to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. When she came back a few hours later, she didn't have much to show for her errands, just a small bag from a boutique and a coffee cup from a chain downtown. What did you get? I asked, gesturing to the bag. Oh, just a few things for work, she said, brushing past me and heading upstairs. I stood in the kitchen, staring after her, my mind racing. Something about her explanation felt off, but I didn't know how to confront her without sounding paranoid. The truth was, I didn't want to believe there was anything to worry about. Carla had been my partner for 16 years. She was the mother of my children, the woman I'd built my life with. The idea that she might be hiding something from me felt impossible. But as the days went on, the little things started piling up. One evening, I noticed she'd started taking longer to get ready for work. She'd always kept a simple routine in the mornings, shower, quick makeup, and out the door. But now she was spending close to an hour in the bathroom, curling her hair, applying layers of foundation and eyeliner, and picking out outfits that looked more suited for a night out than a day at the office. "You're looking sharp these days," I said casually one morning as she adjusted her blouse in the mirror. She glanced at me with a smile. "We've been having a lot of meetings with upper management. I just want to make a good impression." It seemed like a reasonable explanation, but I couldn't help noticing the way she avoided my eyes when she said it. Another night, as we were getting ready for bed, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She grabbed it quickly, her body tensing as she read the message. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," she said, her voice too casual. "Just something from work." She set the phone down and climbed into bed, but I noticed she placed it face down on the nightstand, a habit she'd picked up recently. These small shifts in her behavior might not have seemed like much on their own, but together, they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. Something was different. Carla was different. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Emma, our 15-year-old daughter, walked into the kitchen. "Mom's been going out a lot lately," she said casually, leaning against the counter. I glanced up at her, surprised by her observation. "You've noticed that too, huh?" Emma nodded, fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. "Yeah. And she's been dressing. I don't know, fancier. Like, more than usual." Her words hit me harder than I expected. If even Emma had noticed the changes, it meant they weren't just in my head. "Maybe she's just trying something new," I said, forcing a smile. "People change over time." Emma shrugged but didn't look convinced. "Maybe. I just hope she's okay." Her concern mirrored my own, though I didn't say it out loud. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away. The woman I'd built my life with, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, was becoming a stranger before my eyes. And I had no idea why. As weeks turned into months, the changes in Carla became impossible to ignore. Her wardrobe continued to evolve: tight skirts, plunging necklines, heels that clicked against the hardwood floors with an authority that seemed foreign to her. Her makeup routine grew more elaborate, and she started wearing perfume that lingered in the air long after she left a room. But it wasn't just her appearance. Carla's behavior had shifted in ways that felt even more alarming. She was distracted, constantly scrolling through her phone, her face lit up by messages she never shared with me. She laughed more often now, but not with me. Her laughter was reserved for her phone or conversations she had with people whose names I didn't recognize. She started working late, something she'd never done before. It wasn't every night, but it happened often enough to raise my suspicions. Another late meeting? I asked one evening as she grabbed her keys. Yeah, she said, not even looking at me as she slung her purse over her shoulder. Big projects coming up. I'll try not to be too late. I watched her walk out the door, her heels echoing down the driveway. Something didn't feel right, but I didn't know how to address it without sounding paranoid. One Friday night, Carla announced that her team at work had landed a major client, and they were going out to celebrate. It's just drinks with the team, she said, smoothing down her dress. I shouldn't be too late. I nodded, trying to keep my face neutral. Sounds fun. Who's all going? She hesitated for a fraction of a second before rattling off a list of names, most of which I didn't recognize. And Mr. Grayson, she added, almost as an afterthought. Mr. Grayson, her new boss. He'd been promoted a few months ago, and Carla had mentioned him a handful of times, usually in passing. From what I'd gathered, he was charming, successful, and well-respected at the company. But something about the way she said his name made me uneasy. Let me know when you're on your way home, I said. Of course, she replied, flashing me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the clock as the hours ticked by. 9 p.m. turned into 10, then 11, and still no sign of Carla. When she finally came home close to midnight, her cheeks were flushed, and she smelled faintly of wine and expensive cologne. Good night? I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. It was fine, she said, slipping off her heels. We just talked shop and celebrated a bit. Nothing exciting. I wanted to believe her, but the image of her laughing at some unseen message on her phone kept flashing through my mind. The next morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I hated the idea of snooping, it felt like a betrayal of the trust we'd built over the years. But at this point, I wasn't sure what else to do. When Carla stepped into the shower, I picked up her phone from the nightstand. It was locked, of course, but I knew her passcode, our daughter's birthday. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages. Most of them were harmless, chats with her coworkers, reminders about upcoming meetings. But then I found a thread with a contact saved simply as, G. I opened it, my heart pounding in my chest. The messages weren't explicit, but they were far too personal for my comfort. G, last night was fun. I needed that laugh. Carla, me too. You always know how to make work feel less like work. Smiling face with smiling eyes. Gee, same time next week. Carla, you bet. Can't wait. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Gee, had to be Mr. Grayson. Who else could it be? When Carla came out of the bathroom, I put her phone back where I'd found it and pretended to be reading a magazine. She didn't notice my unease, humming softly as she got dressed. That day, I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept going back to the messages, replaying every word. I told myself they could be innocent, that I was reading too much into them. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Later that week, I decided to follow her. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but the doubt and suspicion were eating me alive. When she announced she'd be working late again, I waited until she left the house, then grabbed my keys and followed her car at a distance. She didn't drive to the office. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot of a trendy bar downtown. I parked a few spaces away and watched as she got out of the car, her dress hugging her figure in a way that felt far too polished for a work event. A few minutes later, a man stepped out of a sleek black car and joined her on the sidewalk. Even from a distance, I recognized him, Mr. Grayson. They exchanged a few words, then walked into the bar together, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. I sat there in my car, my chest tightening with anger and heartbreak. This wasn't a work meeting. This wasn't innocent. For the first time, I had to face the possibility that Carla was betraying me. And the realization shattered something inside me. I stayed in the car for what felt like an eternity, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind was racing, filled with scenarios I didn't want to believe were true. I kept telling myself I was jumping to conclusions, that I had no solid proof of anything yet. But deep down, I knew better. After about 20 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was going on, no matter how much it might hurt. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the bar, keeping my distance and sticking to the shadows. The place was dimly lit, with low music filtering out onto the street. Through the large glass windows, I could see Carla sitting at a corner table with Mr. Grayson. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her hand lightly resting on his arm. It was the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in years, not the polite chuckle she gave me, but something deeper, freer. I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Instead, I stood there, watching from the sidewalk like some pathetic voyeur. My stomach churned as I saw the way they interacted, the subtle touches, the intimate body language, the way her eyes sparkled when she looked at him. Then it happened. He reached across the table and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering just a little too long. She didn't pull away. In fact, she leaned into the gesture, her smile soft and unmistakably affectionate. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just a friendly outing between colleagues. This was something more. I couldn't stand there any longer. I turned on my heel and walked back to the car, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. When I got home, I sat in the darkened living room, replaying the scene over and over in my mind. Every glance, every touch, every laugh felt like a dagger. This wasn't the woman I'd built my life with, the woman I'd trusted for 16 years. Carla came home a few hours later, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. I didn't turn on the light or say anything as she walked into the room. "Oh, you're still up," she said, startled. "I thought you'd be in bed." "Didn't feel like sleeping," I said, my voice flat. She hesitated, standing in the doorway with her purse still slung over her shoulder. "Is everything okay?" I looked at her, my eyes searching her face for any sign of guilt or remorse. But all I saw was calm indifference. "Yeah," I said finally. "Everything's fine." She nodded, clearly relieved, and headed upstairs without another word. I sat there for a long time after she went to bed, wondering how she could lie to my face so effortlessly. Did she think I was blind? Or did she just not care anymore? The next day, I decided I needed definitive proof. I couldn't confront her with half-baked suspicions and accusations. If this was going to come to a head, I needed to know the full truth. I took a day off work and drove to the office where Carla worked. It felt wrong, spying on her like this, but I had no other options. I parked across the street and waited, my stomach churning with a mix of dread and anticipation. Around noon, I saw her step out of the building, her phone pressed to her ear. She was wearing a pencil skirt and a blouse that hugged her curves, paired with heels that made her legs look longer than ever. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but her smile told me it wasn't just a business call. A few minutes later, Mr. Grayson emerged from the building. They met on the sidewalk, and I watched as she slipped her phone into her purse and turned her attention to him. They exchanged a few words, and then he gestured toward a nearby cafe. Carla nodded, and they walked off together, side by side. I followed at a safe distance, keeping to the shadows as they entered the cafe. I stood outside, watching through the window as they sat at a table in the back corner. They leaned in close, their heads almost touching as they talked. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures. I hated myself for it, but I needed evidence, something concrete to confront her with. When I got home that evening, I sat in the living room, staring at the photos on my phone. They were blurry, taken from a distance, but they told a story I couldn't ignore. Carla wasn't just dressing up for work. She wasn't just working late. She was spending time with another man, her boss, and their interactions were anything but professional. The realization hit me like a freight train: my wife was having an affair. I felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and disbelief. How could she do this to me? To our family? After everything we'd been through, after all the promises we'd made, how could she betray me like this? That night, as I lay awake in bed, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this go unanswered. Carla needed to know that I knew, and she needed to face the consequences of her actions. But I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I had every piece of the puzzle. I spent the next few days trying to act normal, even though everything inside me was in turmoil. I went to work, helped the kids with their homework, and made small talk with Carla during dinner. But every time I looked at her, all I could see were the pictures on my phone and the memory of her laughing with Mr. Grayson at the bar. I needed to know the truth, the full, undeniable truth, before I confronted her. I couldn't go into this half-cocked, risking her twisting the story or brushing it off as innocent. So, one evening when Carla said she'd be working late again, I decided to follow her. I left the house a few minutes after she did, keeping a safe distance as I trailed her car. She didn't go to the office. Instead, she drove to a quiet hotel on the outskirts of town, its parking lot dotted with a few cars under dim streetlights. My heart pounded as I parked a few spaces away from her. I watched as she stepped out of the car, her heels clicking on the pavement. She looked around briefly, like she was checking to make sure no one was watching, and then walked toward the hotel entrance. Moments later, a familiar figure emerged from another car. Mr. Grayson. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. This was it. This was the moment that confirmed everything I'd been dreading. They walked into the hotel together, their body language casual but intimate. His hand brushed her lower back as they passed through the doors, a gesture so small yet so damning. I waited in the car for what felt like hours, though it was probably less than one. My mind raced with every possible scenario, but they all led back to the same conclusion: Carla was betraying me. I debated whether to go inside, to catch them in the act and force her to face me then and there. But as much as I wanted to, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want that image burned into my mind forever. Instead, I stayed outside, watching the entrance like a man guarding the ruins of his own life. When they finally came out, they were laughing, their heads close together as they walked back to their cars. I sank lower in my seat, my chest tightening as I watched them part ways. She got into her car and drove off, and I followed her home, keeping my distance. When we got back to the house, she walked in like nothing had happened. She smiled at me, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how the kids were doing. How was work? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Busy, she said with a sigh. But productive. I nodded, watching her as she set her purse down and kicked off her heels. How could she lie so easily? How could she look me in the eye and pretend everything was fine? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long this had been going on and why I hadn't seen it sooner. The signs had been there, the late nights, the change in style, the sudden distance, but I'd ignored them, convincing myself it was just a phase. The next morning, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to confront her. I needed to hear her admit the truth, no matter how much it hurt. After the kids left for school, I sat down at the kitchen table, my phone in hand. When Carla walked in, still in her robe, I gestured for her to sit down. "What's going on?" she asked, frowning as she sat across from me. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I opened my phone and pulled up the photos I'd taken. "I followed you last night," I said, my voice low and steady. "I saw you at the hotel with Grayson." Her face went pale, and for a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth slightly open. "Steve, Don't," I said sharply, holding up a hand. Don't try to lie. I've seen enough. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she pressed her hands to her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never meant for this to happen. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet kitchen. You didn't mean for it to happen. What does that even mean, Carla? You didn't accidentally walk into a hotel with him. You didn't accidentally kiss him or whatever the hell else you've been doing. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. It's not what you think. Don't, I snapped, my voice rising. Don't insult me by pretending this is anything less than what it is. You cheated on me. You betrayed me. Just admit it. Her shoulders slumped, and she nodded slowly. Yes, she said, her voice barely audible. I did. The admission hit me like a punch to the gut, even though I'd already known the truth. Hearing her say it made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. How long? I asked, my voice shaking. She hesitated, then said, a few months. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. Why? Why would you do this to me? To us? She wiped her tears, her voice trembling as she said, I don't know. I've felt so disconnected lately. Like I'm not the person I used to be. And Grayson, he made me feel alive again, like I mattered. I shook my head, my anger boiling over. You mattered to me, Carla. You mattered to our kids. But apparently, that wasn't enough for you. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. But I felt no sympathy. Her tears couldn't undo the damage she'd done. I stood up, my hands trembling as I grabbed my keys. I need some time, I said, my voice cold. Don't expect me to just forgive you for this. I don't even know if I can look at you right now. I walked out the door, her sobs echoing behind me. I drove aimlessly that day, the shock of Carla's confession reverberating in my chest like an echo I couldn't escape. Even though I had prepared myself for the confrontation, hearing her admit to the affair was something else entirely. Her words, he made me feel alive again, played over and over in my head, like a cruel loop designed to punish me. How could she say that? How could she look at me, after 16 years of marriage, 2 kids, and a life we'd built together, and say that? I parked by a quiet park on the edge of town, staring blankly out the windshield. My thoughts were a jumble of anger, sadness, and disbelief. I'd spent years believing we were a team, that we were in this together. But somewhere along the way, Carla had decided that wasn't enough. I tried to piece it all together. Was it me? Had I been too focused on work? Too comfortable in our routine? Or was this just something Carla had been searching for, something I couldn't give her, no matter how hard I tried? The answers didn't come. By the time I returned home that evening, I was emotionally drained. Carla was in the kitchen, her eyes puffy and red. She looked up when I walked in, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't. We didn't speak that night, and I slept in the guest room. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things I wanted to say but couldn't bring myself to. The next few days were no better. Carla tried to talk to me a few times, but every time she opened her mouth, I felt a surge of anger rise up in me. I didn't want to hear her excuses. I didn't want to hear her apologies. What made it worse was that this wasn't just about me and Carla. Our kids, Emma and Lucas, were caught in the middle of this mess, even if they didn't know it yet. I couldn't stand the thought of them finding out, of them looking at their mother the way I now did. But secrets have a way of coming to light. One evening, as I was helping Lucas with his homework, Emma came into the room, her face pale and her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Dad," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "What is it, sweetheart?" I asked, setting down Lucas's math worksheet. She hesitated, her eyes flickering between me and Lucas. "Can we talk? Alone?" Lucas looked up, confused, but I nodded. Go grab a snack, bud. I'll help you with the rest in a minute. Once Lucas was out of the room, Emma sat down across from me, her hands shaking. She placed her phone on the table and slid it toward me. I didn't mean to see it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I did. I picked up the phone, my heart sinking as I saw what was on the screen, a message thread between Carla and Mr. Grayson. The texts were flirty, suggestive, and far too intimate for coworkers. My hands trembled as I set the phone down. Where did you get this? Mom left her laptop open, Emma said, her voice cracking. It was synced with her phone. I saw the messages, and I didn't know what to do. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked at me, pleading. Dad, what's going on? Is she cheating on you? I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My 15-year-old daughter had stumbled into the darkest secret of our marriage, and now she was looking to me for answers I didn't know how to give. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Emma, I said softly, your mom made a mistake. A big mistake. And we're trying to figure out what happens next. Her tears spilled over, and she shook her head. How could she do this? To you? To us? I didn't have an answer. All I could do was pull her into a hug, holding her as she cried. I don't know, sweetheart, I whispered. But none of this is your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. Over the next few days, Emma withdrew from Carla almost entirely. She avoided her mother's attempts to talk, spent more time in her room, and refused to acknowledge her during dinner. Lucas, being younger, didn't notice the tension right away. But one evening, as the three of us were sitting in the living room, he overheard Emma and me talking about the affair. What's an affair? He asked, looking between us with wide eyes. Emma froze, her face turning red. I felt a lump form in my throat as I struggled to find the right words. It's when someone breaks a promise, I said carefully. A big promise. And it hurts people. Lucas frowned, his young mind trying to piece it together. Did Mom break a promise? I hesitated, then nodded. Yes, buddy. She did. His face crumpled, and he ran upstairs, slamming his bedroom door behind him. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I felt the weight of everything crashing down around me. My marriage was falling apart, my children were hurting, and I didn't know how to fix any of it. Carla's betrayal wasn't just between us anymore. It had seeped into every corner of our family, poisoning the bonds we'd spent years building. And no matter what I did, there was no going back to the way things were. The days after Lucas found out about the affair were some of the hardest I've ever endured. I could feel the walls of our family collapsing around us, each of us retreating into our own corners of the house, unsure of how to face one another. Carla tried to talk to Lucas, but he barely looked at her. When she knocked on his door one evening, I overheard their brief exchange through the thin walls. Lucas, sweetheart, can we talk? Carla asked, her voice trembling. No, he replied bluntly. Go away. Please, Lucas, she said, her tone breaking. I know you're upset, but I said go away, he yelled, and the door slammed shut a moment later. I watched Carla retreat down the hall, her shoulders slumped, tears streaming down her face. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of pity for her. But then I remembered the choices she'd made, the choices that had led us here, and the sympathy evaporated. Emma wasn't much different. She stayed in her room most of the time, her earbuds firmly in place as she ignored Carla's attempts to engage her. When she did come downstairs, it was only to speak to me or grab something to eat before retreating again. One evening, she finally broke her silence. Dad, she said quietly, sitting down across from me at the kitchen table. What are we going to do? I sighed, rubbing my temples. I don't know, Emma. I'm trying to figure that out. She hesitated, then said, Are you going to leave her? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked at my daughter, her hazel eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness, and I realized she was old enough to understand the gravity of the situation. I don't know yet, I admitted. This isn't something I can decide overnight. But no matter what happens, I promise I'll be here for you and Lucas. That's never going to change. She nodded, though her expression remained heavy. I don't think I can forgive her, she said after a long pause. You don't have to, I said softly. Not now, not ever, if that's how you feel. But you don't have to make that decision today either. Emma's lip trembled, and she quickly wiped away a tear. It's not fair, she whispered. I know, sweetheart, I said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. It's not fair at all. Meanwhile, Carla seemed to be unraveling. She stopped dressing up for work and began spending most of her time in sweats, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She looked like a shell of the woman I once knew, exhausted, withdrawn, and haunted. One evening, she cornered me in the kitchen, her eyes red and puffy. Steve, she said, her voice breaking. I'm losing them. I'm losing all of you. I didn't respond right away, focusing instead on wiping down the counter. Do you even care? She asked, her tone desperate. I turned to face her, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. Care. Of course I care, Carla. But you made these choices. You're the one who put us in this position. I know, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But I didn't think it would get this bad. I didn't think I'd lose my family. Well, what did you think would happen? I snapped, my voice rising. Did you think you could sneak around, betray me, and it would all just go away? She sobbed, shaking her head. I don't know. I wasn't thinking. I was stupid, and selfish, and I hate myself for it. Her words were raw, but they didn't move me. I felt hollow, like I'd run out of emotions to give her. The kids hate me, she said, her voice barely audible. They're hurt, Carla, I said. You broke their trust, just like you broke mine. That's not something you can fix with a few apologies. I'll do whatever it takes, she said, her hands clutching the edge of the counter. I'll talk to them, I'll go to therapy, I'll. Stop, I said, cutting her off. This isn't something you can fix with a checklist. You made a choice, and now you're living with the consequences. If you really want to make it right, focus on them. Be a better mom. That's the only thing that matters now. She nodded, wiping her tears, but I could see the despair in her eyes. She knew she'd lost something she might never get back. Over the next few weeks, the distance between Carla and the kids only grew. Lucas avoided her completely, while Emma remained cold and distant. Our house, once filled with laughter and warmth, felt like a battleground, tense, quiet, and fractured. One evening, as I was tucking Lucas into bed, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. Dad, he whispered, are we ever going to be okay again? I felt my throat tighten as I sat down on the edge of his bed. I don't know, buddy, I said honestly. But I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure you and Emma are okay. He nodded, wiping his eyes. I miss how things used to be. Me too, I said softly, pulling him into a hug. Me too. As I left his room that night, I couldn't help but feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. Our family was falling apart, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to hold it together. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if it could ever be fixed. Carla's spiral into guilt and regret was impossible to miss. She looked hollowed out, like someone who hadn't truly slept in weeks. Gone were the carefully styled outfits, the vibrant makeup, and the confident demeanor that had once filled the room whenever she walked in. Now, she was quieter, her presence diminished, as if she were trying to disappear into the background of our broken home. But the worst of it wasn't how she looked, it was how she acted. For the first time in years, Carla seemed completely lost. The woman who had once been a pillar of strength in our family now stumbled through each day, uncertain and directionless. I caught her sitting in the living room one evening, staring at an old family photo on the mantel. It was from a vacation we'd taken to the beach years ago. In the picture, Emma and Lucas were grinning ear to ear, their faces sticky with ice cream, while Carla and I sat behind them, arms wrapped around each other. Carla's hand trembled as she traced her finger over the glass. "We were happy," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. I stood in the doorway, unsure how to respond. "We had everything," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I threw it all away." I wanted to agree with her, to let my anger out in full force, but I held back. I was too tired for another fight, and her remorse, while long overdue, felt genuine. "You didn't just throw it away," I said after a long pause. "You hurt everyone in the process." She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know," she whispered. "I know I did." I walked away without saying anything more, leaving her alone with her guilt. As the days passed, Carla tried to make amends in small ways. She started cooking breakfast for the kids again, even though they barely touched the food. She cleaned the house, stayed off her phone, and made every effort to engage with Emma and Lucas. But it was too late. The kids weren't interested in her attempts at reconciliation. Emma brushed past her without a word most mornings, her earbuds in and her expression cold. Lucas, once a cheerful and affectionate boy, avoided her entirely, retreating to his room whenever she was around. One evening, Carla tried to talk to Emma in the kitchen. "Hey, sweetie," she said, her voice soft and tentative. "How was school today?" Emma shrugged, not even looking up from her plate. "Did anything exciting happen?" Carla pressed, her tone painfully cheerful. "No," Emma said curtly, shoving a piece of food into her mouth and turning away. Carla's face crumpled, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. But Emma didn't care, or maybe she cared too much to show it. Either way, she stood up, grabbed her plate, and walked out of the room without another word. I watched as Carla sat there, staring at the empty chair Emma had left behind. Her shoulders shook as she buried her face in her hands, her quiet sobs echoing in the stillness of the kitchen. Later that night, she came to me. "Steve," she said, her voice trembling, "I don't know what to do anymore. I've lost them. I've lost you. I feel like I'm disappearing." I looked at her, my emotions a confusing mix of pity, anger, and indifference. "You're feeling the consequences of your actions," I said bluntly. "You can't expect the kids, or me, to just forget what you've done." "I don't expect that," she said quickly. I don't know how to fix it. I don't even know if it can be fixed." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "You broke something, Carla. Something important. And now you're realizing how fragile it all was. You can't fix this overnight, and honestly, I don't know if it's even fixable. But if you really want to make things right, start by being honest, with yourself and with the kids." Her tears flowed freely now, and she nodded. "I'll try," she whispered. The next day, she took the first step toward that honesty. She sat Emma and Lucas down in the living room, her hands trembling as she faced them. "I know I've hurt you both," she began, her voice breaking. "And I'm so sorry. I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know how much I love you. Both of you." Lucas sat with his arms crossed, his face unreadable, while Emma stared at the floor. "I know it'll take time," Carla continued. "Maybe you'll never forgive me, and I'll have to live with that. But I want to be better, for you. I want to prove that I'm still your mom, no matter how badly I've messed up." Emma finally looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "You should have thought about that before you cheated," she said coldly, her voice shaking with emotion. Lucas stood up without a word and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing up the stairs. Carla crumpled into the couch, her sobs filling the silence once again. From my place in the hallway, I watched the scene unfold with a heavy heart. Her realization had come too late, and now we were all living with the fallout. Carla's tearful confession to Emma and Lucas didn't mend any bridges. If anything, it seemed to solidify the distance between her and the kids. Emma became even colder, her resentment palpable. Lucas barely spoke to anyone, retreating into his room and losing himself in video games or sketching in his notebook. The house was quieter now, but not in a peaceful way. It felt like a place weighed down by unspoken emotions, by walls that had grown too high for anyone to climb. Carla continued trying to connect with the kids, but her efforts only seemed to push them further away. Emma was openly hostile at times, rolling her eyes or walking out of the room whenever Carla tried to speak to her. Lucas, on the other hand, shut down entirely. He wouldn't even sit at the same table as her during meals, opting to eat in his room instead. I hated seeing them like this. My kids were hurting, and no matter how hard I tried to shield them from the fallout, it wasn't enough. One evening, after Lucas had gone to bed, I found Emma sitting on the porch steps, staring out into the dark yard. "Hey," I said softly, sitting down beside her. She didn't look at me, but she didn't move away either. "I don't get it, Dad," she said after a long silence. "Why would she do this? Why would she ruin everything?" I sighed, staring out at the faint glow of the streetlights. "I don't know, sweetheart. Sometimes people make selfish choices. Choices they can't take back." Emma wiped her eyes angrily. "I hate her for what she did to you. To us." Her words hit me hard, but I didn't try to defend Carla. "It's okay to feel that way," I said. "You're allowed to be angry. But don't let that anger eat you up inside. It'll only hurt you more." She nodded, though I could tell she wasn't ready to let go of her resentment. "Do you think things will ever be normal again?" she asked quietly. I hesitated. "Normal might look different now. But we'll figure it out. I promise." The truth was, I wasn't sure I believed my own words. Carla, for her part, was crumbling. She spent her days cleaning a house that was already spotless, baking cookies the kids wouldn't eat, and sitting alone in the living room, staring at old family photos. Her attempts to reconnect were genuine, but they came too late. The damage was done, and the kids weren't ready, or willing, to move past it. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, Carla knocked on the door of the guest room where I'd been sleeping. "Steve," she said hesitantly, peeking inside. "What is it?" I asked, not bothering to hide the exhaustion in my voice. She stepped inside, clutching a tissue in her hand. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Again. For everything. I looked at her, her face pale and worn, and I felt a flicker of the love I used to have for her. But it was buried beneath layers of hurt and anger. "I know you are," I said, keeping my tone neutral. She took a shaky breath. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again? As a family?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "That's not just up to me. It's up to the kids too. And right now, they're not ready to forgive you. I don't know if they ever will be." Her lip trembled, and she wiped her eyes with the tissue. "I miss them. I miss you." I didn't respond. What could I say? I missed the life we used to have too, but that life was gone now, replaced by something fractured and unrecognizable. The next morning, I woke up to find Carla sitting at the kitchen table with a suitcase by her side. "What's this?" I asked, gesturing to the bag. "I think I need to leave," she said quietly. "Just for a little while. The kids need space, and I don't think I'm helping by being here." I stared at her, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell her to stay and face the consequences of her actions, to keep trying to fix the mess she'd made. But another part of me knew she was right. Her presence was a constant reminder of the pain she'd caused, and the kids were suffocating under the weight of it. "Where will you go?" I asked finally. "I'll stay with my sister for a while," she said. "It's not far. I'll still be close enough if they want to see me." I nodded, my throat tight. "You should tell them." She hesitated, then nodded. That evening, Carla sat Emma and Lucas down in the living room. She explained that she would be leaving for a while, giving them space to heal and process everything. Emma stared at the floor, her expression unreadable, while Lucas looked like he was holding back tears. When Carla finished, she stood and walked toward the door. "I love you," she said, her voice breaking. "Both of you." Neither of them responded. As I watched her walk out the door, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a lingering sense of loss. This wasn't how things were supposed to end. But maybe, just maybe, it was the first step towards something better. With Carla gone, the house felt eerily quiet. The kids and I settled into a new routine, though it was more out of necessity than a genuine sense of normalcy. Each day started with the usual chaos of getting ready for school, Lucas scrambling to find his homework, Emma barely acknowledging my attempts at small talk, but there was an unspoken weight in the air, something that hung over us no matter how much we tried to ignore it. I focused on keeping things as steady as I could for them. After work, I helped Lucas with his math, encouraged Emma with her art projects, and made sure we had family dinners, even if the conversations were short and stilted. One evening, as we sat around the table, Lucas finally broke the silence. "Do you think Mom's coming back?" he asked, his voice small. Emma stiffened, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. I set down my glass of water, choosing my words carefully. "I don't know," I admitted. "Right now, she's giving us space. But she still loves you both, no matter where she is." Lucas frowned, pushing his food around his plate. "Then why did she leave?" "Because she made a mistake," Emma said sharply, her tone laced with bitterness. "And now she's running away from it." "Emma," I said gently, "that's not fair." "Isn't it?" she shot back, glaring at me. "She's the one who ruined everything, and now we're the ones stuck dealing with it." Her words stung, not because they were directed at me but because they weren't entirely wrong. Lucas looked back and forth between us, his eyes wide and uncertain. I want things to go back to how they were," he whispered. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Me too, buddy. But sometimes, we can't go back. We just have to move forward the best we can." Emma rolled her eyes, muttering something under her breath before pushing her chair back and leaving the table. I let her go. Forcing her to stay wouldn't change how she felt, and I knew she needed time to process everything in her own way. Later that night, as I sat in the living room flipping through channels, Lucas came and sat beside me. "Do you think she's sorry?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I sighed, putting the remote down. "I think she is. But being sorry doesn't fix things. It takes more than that." He nodded, leaning against my shoulder. "I still love her," he said quietly. "I know you do," I said, wrapping an arm around him. "And that's okay. You don't have to stop loving her just because she made a mistake." But for Emma, it wasn't so simple. She kept her distance from everyone, retreating into her room and rarely coming out except for school or meals. I tried to reach her, but every time I knocked on her door, I was met with silence or a curt, "I'm fine." One night, I found a sketchpad she'd left on the kitchen counter. Flipping through the pages, I saw drawing after drawing of fractured images, shattered glass, broken chains, a tree with its roots severed. The art was raw and emotional, a clear reflection of the pain she was feeling but couldn't express in words. I left the sketchpad where I found it, but the images stayed with me. Emma was hurting more than she let on, and I didn't know how to help her. As the weeks passed, Carla continued to call and text. She kept her distance physically but made every effort to stay connected with the kids. Lucas would talk to her occasionally, his voice brightening slightly whenever he answered her calls. Emma, however, refused to engage. "I don't want to talk to her," she said firmly one evening when I handed her the phone. "Emma, she's still your mom," I said gently. "She stopped being my mom the second she decided to cheat," she snapped, pushing the phone away. I didn't push her further. Carla's absence gave me time to reflect on everything that had happened. As much as I wanted to hate her, I couldn't. She was the mother of my children, the woman I'd once loved more than anything. But that didn't mean I could forgive her either. One evening, she called me directly. "Steve," she began, her voice hesitant, "I've been thinking about us. About everything." "What about it?" I asked, my tone neutral. "I know I've messed up," she said, her voice trembling. "And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want to try to fix things. For the kids. For us." I closed my eyes, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "Carla, I don't think that's possible," I said after a long pause. "Why not?" she asked, her voice breaking. "We've been through so much together. Doesn't that count for anything?" "It does," I said quietly. "But trust is the foundation of any relationship, and you destroyed that. I can't rebuild something that's so completely broken." She sobbed softly on the other end of the line, but I didn't feel the need to comfort her. "What about the kids?" she asked. "Do you think they'll ever forgive me?" "I don't know," I admitted. "That's up to them. All you can do is keep trying to show them that you care." When the call ended, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. It was clear that Carla was still grappling with the consequences of her actions, but I couldn't carry her guilt for her. My focus was on Emma and Lucas now, on helping them heal and move forward, even if Carla wasn't fully part of the picture anymore. Life didn't magically get better after Carla left. The scars of her betrayal lingered in the house, in the way Emma avoided family conversations and Lucas clung to me a little tighter every night. But over time, the three of us began to find a new rhythm. I poured all my energy into being the best father I could. Weekends were filled with movie nights, trips to the park, and small moments of connection that reminded me of what I still had, a family worth fighting for, even if it looked different now. Emma started channeling her emotions into her art. Her sketches, once dark and fractured, began to show hints of hope, trees with budding leaves, shattered glass pieced back together. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was progress. One evening, she surprised me by sitting down at the dinner table and actually talking. "I don't think I'll ever forgive her," she said suddenly, her voice calm but firm. I set my fork down, looking at her carefully. "That's your choice, Emma. You don't have to forgive her if you're not ready." She nodded, her eyes thoughtful. I don't think I can trust her again. She broke something, and I don't know if it can ever be fixed." Her words mirrored my own feelings in a way that was both heartbreaking and validating. "Trust is hard to rebuild," I said gently. "But it's okay to take your time. You don't have to figure it all out now." Lucas, meanwhile, had started to come out of his shell. He joined the school soccer team and began spending more time with friends, his laughter slowly returning. One evening, as I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me with wide eyes. "Do you think Mom's sad?" he asked. "I think so," I said honestly. "She knows she made a mistake, and it's hard for her to see how much it hurt us." He nodded, frowning. "I still love her. But I don't want her to come back." His honesty struck me. "It's okay to feel that way," I said. "Love doesn't go away just because someone makes a mistake. But it's also okay to want space." Carla continued to reach out, but her relationship with the kids remained strained. She texted Lucas regularly, and while he responded sporadically, their conversations were brief and cautious. Emma, on the other hand, refused all contact. She deleted Carla's messages without reading them and ignored her calls entirely. As for me, I'd come to terms with the fact that our marriage was over. I didn't hate Carla anymore, I didn't have the energy to hold on to that anger, but I also knew I couldn't welcome her back into my life. The trust we'd once shared was shattered, and no amount of apologies could put it back together. Months passed, and slowly, the pain began to fade. It didn't disappear entirely, it never does, but it became more manageable. I found myself laughing more, enjoying time with the kids without the constant weight of what had happened. One afternoon, as I was picking Lucas up from soccer practice, I ran into his coach, Ms. Anderson. She was friendly and warm, with a quick wit that put people at ease. Over time, we started talking more, about the kids, about life, about the small victories and challenges we faced every day. It wasn't long before I started to look forward to our conversations. She had a way of making me feel seen, like I wasn't just a man carrying the pieces of a broken marriage but someone who still had something to offer. One evening, after practice, she invited me out for coffee. It wasn't a date, not officially, but there was something about the way she smiled at me that made me wonder if it could be. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about Carla, about everything that had happened. But then I looked at Lucas, laughing with his friends on the field, and Emma, who was waiting for me at home with a new sketch to show me. I realized then that my life wasn't defined by Carla's betrayal. It was defined by the choices I made moving forward. Sure, I said, smiling back at Ms. Anderson. Coffee sounds great. The past had left its mark on me, on all of us, but I refused to let it hold me back. I had a family to care for, a future to build, and maybe, even after all the heartbreak, a chance to find happiness again. And that, I realized, was what mattered most. Moral of the story. Betrayal can shatter even the strongest of bonds, but it doesn't have to define you. Life is about the choices you make after the fall, choosing to rebuild, to grow, and to find joy in the people and moments that truly matter.